When war broke out, did we turn to the hands to do things?
Absolutely. They were the ones that were immediately inducted into the Signal Corps because they know how to use the radios. Matter of fact, a lot of them helped develop them.
What is Singapore?
So it's a branch of the army, and they started out with semaphore flags. There was a signal corps, I think, pre-Civil War was a one-man operation who started organizing soldiers to learn the wigwagging, they called it, signaling with flags, which was good for, as far as you could see, 5, 6, 7 miles from the top of a hill to the top of the hill. The military applications of communication really came about in the Civil War. The telegraph was well established by the Civil War. And so now orders and reports could be communicated instantly via telegraph. Take yourself back for a minute. If you read anything about the Revolutionary War, the British orders would come from England by ship to the generals in the colonies. Well, and then if the general didn't like the orders or he thought he had a better idea, he would send back his reply by ship. Well, meanwhile, things are developing. It's happening. So you've got to move out. So the people in England that might not know for a month that something had happened that was contrary to whatever they thought was happening or what they had, quote unquote, ordered to happen. So now all of a sudden, fast forward to the 1860s, and orders and reports and status and so forth are being transmitted instantly. And that's when the Army really established the Signal Corps, because you needed people to string these wires along and to send messages over using the telegraph keys and the relays and so forth. And so the Signal Corps developed in the Army at that point. There was some radio communication during World War I, but most of what was done was using wires. They'd lay wires across a battlefield or from a headquarters out to a forward position and talk either, again, telegraph or telephone. World War II, radio had been significantly evolved by that point. So all of the hams, and hams, by the way, like to be called hams. Even
Badge of honor.
acceptable. It's a badge of honor. If you called me an amateur radio operator, I would just call me a ham. So all of the hams immediately were pulled into these radio companies, brigades, battalions, and were organized to support all of the military battle activities. And should be no surprise, all the ham radio manufacturers started making military radios. The Hallicrafters Company is a perfect example. We have here at the museum a mobile high-power radio station called the SCR 399, and all the equipment in there was Hallicrafters manufactured amateur radio equipment adapted to use for military. So they're all 299, 399, and 499, kind of different configurations. It could have been an amphibious thing, these ducks that they could drive up on the beach. Could be in a truck. Could be in crates. They dropped them out of an airplane when the airborne companies invaded during the D-Day. So the SCR 299, 399, whatever, was a major radio station to transmit from battalion headquarters kind of level back to the UK, where Eisenhower and the commanding generals all were, so they could instantly get reports on what was actually happening in the field and send orders out to direct the battle. As you moved further and further towards the front lines, the radios got smaller, not that small, like a guy in the field had a thing they called a handy talkie because he could hold it in his hand, but I think it weighed about 7 pounds. So it'd be like holding up 2 bricks in your hand. After a while, your arm's going to get kind of tired. And then they had what they called the walkie-talkie, which was a 40-pound backpack radio. I could barely walk with that on my
It's a
back, but
big antenna that's going like this.
and then further back, you had a sort of a desktop thing that came in a crate and took 3 people to carry and set up, so they could communicate back and back and back. On D-Day, there were over 90,000 radio transmitters operating in France. Somebody had to figure out how they were going to establish frequencies for 90,000 transmitters so they wouldn't interfere with each other. And they came up with a scheme, and they still ran out of frequencies. Back those days, the radio frequency was controlled with something we called crystals. They were quartz crystals and a little mounting, and the thickness and shape of that crystal determined the frequency that the radio would ultimately transmit on. So so when they ran out of bandwidth, they said, you know, one solution to this, instead of having what we call a 5 kilohertz channel separation, we can live with shrinking it down to 4 kilohertz. Well, but lo and behold, they'd already manufactured all the crystals for the 5 kilohertz separation. So they sent teams out to the UK from the US to regrind and modify those crystals for all of the new frequencies in the matter of about 6 weeks. So there's all these background stories about the certainly you can't deny the bravery and the skills of the people who actually fought at Normandy and beyond, but all of the logistics and technology behind that to make that a success. And when we run our special events, we talk about the role of electronics in World War II. These are the kind of stories that people don't hear that much.
So it's
90,000
crazy.
radio
So
transmitters.
it sounds like they needed to get a lot of signals out in a limited bandwidth. Okay. So there's a guy from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, by the name of Arthur Collins, who took a look at the voice transmission, and he says, you know what? He says that signal doesn't have to be that wide, because basically the same information is transmitted below the carrier and above the carrier. And he said, you know, we don't need that part above the carrier. I get rid of it. Transmitted the part below the carrier. And he says, you know what? We don't need the carrier itself either. All you need is what's called a sideband. And that's what he did. He came up with a system of transmission for voice or phone called single sideband. So if you listen to it on a regular radio, it would sound like Donald Duck. It just didn't sound right. So what do you have to do?
You
Well,
have to get your little recording of it.
for a radio to receive a single sideband signal, you needed what's known as a beat frequency oscillator. You have to put that carrier, I mentioned the carrier, the thing in the middle has to be there. Well, that's got to be reinserted back at the receiver. But since it's at the receiver and there's no reference for it, you got to kind of tune around, and you either sound like Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse or Goofy or something until you get it right.
Yeah, if you want, you and I could go on Zoom, and I'll live tune a radio for you, and you can record it, and then you'll see what Russ is talking about.
So this is great, because what it did is it reduced that 5 kilohertz that Tom was talking about down to
Well, it took
2.1.
It took 10 down to 3, really.
10 down to 3, really, yeah.
So you use 30% of the bandwidth, maybe that.
Yeah. So that was a major technological innovation, and I don't know.
Started using it before the military.
Yeah.
It was basically something that hams experimented with it, and then because sideband wasn't really used in World War II.
It wasn't. It was after World War II. I was just going to mention that. It was 47 or something came into it, but it made a big difference. And then, then they got into the digital era. And ships at sea started transmitting almost all their messages via what's known as multi-frequency radio teletype. And this is where they were able to multiplex a whole bunch of radio teletype signals in a very narrow bandwidth and get a lot of information through there. And it is really no different than modern digital.
The military used it in World War II.
Yeah.
And we need to tell that story better at the museum. I'll have to talk to Aubrey. You and I should collaborate.
Oh, that'd be fun to do that. Yeah.
Because we've got, and I don't know what the plan is here, but at the both of the other locations, we had Morse 1850s version telegraph keys separated by 6 or 10 feet or something like that. And in the middle is a teleprinter, which was what was used for the teletype.
For teletypes.
It looks like a big monster typewriter. It's got a QWERTY keyboard, and it's black and ugly.
So it's like typing, actually.
Yes, it is.
Automatically teletypes.
Yeah.
It's a printer. It's a printer.
So you type in the message, and then at the other end of the wire, the message comes out printed on a sheet of paper. So the way we're telling that story at the museum right now is not thorough enough. It just sits there and says, here's a teletype, and it was invented in 1934 or something like that. But it was really the first digital communication technique. It was used in World War II.
That's exactly what it was. No, it really wasn't
It
even that analog. It was pretty much
It was
digital.
digital. It uses digital is all about ones and zeros. Okay, it's a an on or an off or whatever else. So in teletype, those are called mark and space. So it's the same as a one and a zero or an off and an on situation. 'Cause you'll hear something these days about ASCII coding
Mhm.
for computers where you have 8 bits to make a letter, for example. In teletype, they had a 5-bit code known as a Baudot code, and it's digital. It's no different from the way we transmit text messages today in terms of the theoretical
So if you think
implementation.
that all this digital communication you're doing is
It's the same
new,
first century
it's
thing. It was
it has
invented in the
it's
1930s.
been refined so that the message density can be dramatically better. But that's really the only difference.
Yeah.
Faster, more density, and faster. It's still the same. And even sending a picture is just basically sending data. It's the same kind of data that Tom's talking.
Pictures were being sent on D-Day over radio. They
Mhm.
had it's like faxing. Uh, Do you know about faxing? They used to do that all the time. So aircraft surveillance overflights over France would return to the UK. They'd develop the film, and if it had significant intelligence to send back to commanders in the field, they would send the pictures via radio. And it's a radio facsimile situation. Hams still do this with something called slow scan television, where they send pictures to each other over the radio.
And that's basic. It was the same technology, and it's basically like a TV. Okay, a fax system is like a slow TV,
It only sends one picture at a time.
but
It
one
doesn't.
picture at a
If you want
time.
if you want it to move, you have to assemble. Did you ever do this thing where you flip the pages and
Yeah.
it had motion?
Yeah.
It would be like that, except you
Yeah.
send them really slow and then you can flip the pages. But
Yeah.
they had the ability to send, again, teletype messages back and forth, facsimiles, photographs. Well, in 1944, time after the invasion, all of that was going on. So from D-Day to VE Day was 11 months or something like that. So over that period of time, those things were all being done. The more reliable and secure way of communicating is with wire rather than radio, because you're not worrying about propagation conditions, intercept by the other forces or hostiles. So the sequence of events, initially they would relay from the Normandy area back to England and then further on to wherever the headquarters were in London and so forth, using SCR 399 type equipment. Then they put in what are called VHF, very high frequency relay stations, which could send multiple channels of voice and data at the same time. So they would relay, and this is good for 100 or so miles. So they built these relay stations. The SCR 399 has one transmitter, so only one message can be transmitted at a time. These relay stations could have had multiple channels to send more and more stuff. And then once everything was secure, they actually laid cable across the English Channel so that they didn't have to rely on radio as much. But as they moved forward, obviously the Germans would destroy all their wiring and telephone. They had to rebuild the whole French telephone system because as the Germans retreated, they destroyed everything. So in between laying new wires, they had SCR forward deployed, for example, to battle the Bulge. But like I said, gradually, this was the first step, and then the next step would be to put in multi-channel relay stations, and then wire was the best. You could put more stuff and it'd be more secure. You'd build in that as you rolled along, and these Signal Corps people took care of all of that.
Right.
While everything else is going on. So again, the guy out in the field has got this little box telephone in a leather bag with a crank on it, like on MASH, radar. Sparky, it's radar, and he's cranking on the thing. Well, at the next level, there's all these wires are coming in from all these forward position, and there's a switchboard where guys either plugging or throwing switches to make connections. I want to talk to the battalion headquarters. Okay. And he flips a wire. He might have to talk to the next guy on the next switchboard to make that connection, but still very secure because it's just wire. It's not relying on any kind of radio signals. And then instead of voice, they would replace it with the teletypes because they could send much more efficiently, less chances of being. When we talk on the radio, we have to use phonetic alphabets sometimes. Like I'll say, if I'm talking to Russ, because of static and interference and what we call fading, the signal goes up and down. We use a phonetic alphabet, and I'll say, the name here is Tom, Tango Oscar Mike. And Russ doesn't even hear Tom. He hears Tango Oscar Mike, or he'll say, Romeo Uniform Sierra Sierra. And so that we're kind of programmed to substitute.
And
those
you have
phonetics.
heard this many, many times. Matter of fact, if you're booking a plane reservation, most of the plane reservation, well, if you talk to somebody on the phone, which you don't anymore, but know you're right, know that the phonetic alphabet. It's called the ICAO phonetic alphabet, or the NATO phonetic
standard
or NATO
phonetics.
standard. But right here at Martin Airport, used all the time. You listen to anything, anytime you tell a tail number of an airplane, and there's an alphabetic character, you use it. It's Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta Echo Foxtrot Golf Hotel India Juliet, et cetera, et cetera. And you just sort of memorize it, and it makes it a lot easier to spell stuff out. And by the way, Z is Z, because Z can sound like C.